would like to welcome and thank Professor Cas Mudde from the University of Georgia to give this interview to our project Mudral about the far right. And we'll have some questions for him related to his work. And of course, we are pretty much aware and interested about the far right in Brazil, since we have the government of Bolsonaro. And unfortunately, we have the elections in Argentina this week on Saturday, and Milei, who is also considered to a certain extent a far-right leader, was elected. So what we can see is that in Latin America, we are following this, and we know that even in Brazil, after the end of the government of Bolsonaro, movements, and especially in the social medias, but also in other spaces, the far right is still there. So we are concerned with the local elections, with next elections. So what seemed to be a completely break in Brazil with this government, apparently something that remained after the end of Bolsonaro's mandate. So I think we are very happy to be able to talk to Cas Mudde, who has been researching this for many years. And so I think the first question we'll have for you is, when did you start studying the extreme right and why?
Yeah, thank you. Let me shortly introduce myself, as well as give consent for this interview to be used within the project, within the frame of the project. I'm originally from the Netherlands, and I'm a political scientist, a comparativist, who works mostly on European party politics, but I've worked on the far right really seriously since I was an undergraduate at the University of Leiden. I would say in the very early 1990s. I wrote my MA thesis on it, and then my PhD, and have since then always kind of worked on the far right while I also did other stuff. And the reason is very Dutch. So when I started working on the far right, I think my first project ever was a paper in a course. And at that point in time, we had only one radical right party, which got less than 1% of the vote. But because of the proportional system that we have, they were represented in parliament in 1982, to be exact. And that led to massive protests. And the thing is that the Netherlands had this strong Holocaust trauma. I think only to a certain extent comparable to Germany, although the Germans have self-guilt, the Dutch don't. But growing up in the Netherlands, the far right was always a major topic, even though it was completely marginal in terms of actual existence. There was this innate fear of the far right, and there was, as a consequence, an obsession with the far right, which led to this one party, which got less than 1% of the vote, dominate the whole story. And so I think that's what attracted me. I've actually never been particularly interested in the far right itself. I don't find them that mesmerizing or remarkable. I'm interested in how they affect the particularly liberal democratic structure in which they operate.
No, thank you. And so we'll come actually to these effects, because in our project, exactly one of our main concerns is the effects of the far right on the multilateral system. But before we get there, perhaps if we could, when you started studying then, of course, the far right in Europe, and well, you wrote about this 4 waves, but when we still talking about Europe, do you see any difference between the far right in former, well, what we used to call former Western and Eastern Europe, or do you think they're both derived from the first and second waves of far right?
And so the idea of the waves is very much based on Western Europe, because it pretty much all took place during the Cold War, during which you didn't have, of course, free politics within within Eastern Europe. The third wave, which started in the 1980s, and in my opinion, kind of ended in 2000. If you just look at that period, you had far-right parties in the East and the West. But if you look at the main cause in the most simplistic terms, in terms of issues, then they were very different, because the third wave was defined by Klaus von Weimar as a response to unemployment and immigration. And immigration played no role whatsoever in the former East until the so-called refugee crisis of 2015. And so in that sense, it was different. I also think in terms of the relationship to the mainstream, there was a major difference, for the simple reason that there was an established mainstream in Western Europe, which had been pretty much dominating since 1945 in most countries, whereas in Central and Eastern Europe, there wasn't. Everything was new. And so the distinction between mainstream and challenger wasn't that clear, particularly in the 1990s. It's becoming clearer now. There was also much less sensitivity around issues like nativism, like authoritarianism. And so the strong distinction that characterized, I would say, the third wave, in which the radical right was seen as outside of the political spectrum, unacceptable, challenging it, that we didn't have in the East, without necessarily saying that they were just one of the parties that depended on the country. In terms of trends, I think what defines the fourth wave or phase is the extreme heterogeneity of the far right in terms of the different forms, the different ideologies, different focuses, different levels of organization. You see that in the East and the West. You also have the mainstreaming of the far right, which you again see in the East and the West, although, as said, in the East, they didn't have to mainstream in the same way because the mainstream was less defined. And the normalization, which is a different process, which kind of means that some of the key views of the radical right have become considered common sense, hegemonic, if you will, non-ideological. You see that in Eastern Europe as well as Western Europe. So finally, because of the so-called refugee crisis in 2015-16, the focus of the radical right in Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe, has become much more on immigration and multiculturalism than before, which makes the far right overall in Europe more similar today than it was in the 1990s.
Interesting. And talking about this heterogeneity, how do you see then the rise of the far right in the US? Because then it's a completely different setting, no? from Europe. And in the case of the US, there used to be this concept of the US exceptionalism, no? Based among others in its democracy and democratic system and its role in promoting democracy. So how do you explain the rise of the far right in the US and Trump? I mean, how different then is this from these previous movements and trends in Europe?
Now, I think you have to distinguish between three different levels. You have the far right at the level of society, attitudinal level. And then you have it in terms of electoral support. And then you have it in terms of political relevance. And the translation of one to the other is not straightforward. So we had probably a far higher level of support for far-right attitudes in the 60s, 70s than we have today, but we didn't have far-right parties. And so you didn't see them in elections. On top of that, we didn't vote on social cultural issues. We voted on social economic issues, which again, the translation of these attitudes into electoral support wasn't there. Now, the other thing is the relationship between electoral support and political relevance is translated through the electoral system. And so, on the one hand, was I surprised to see a far-right president in the US? Yes. Did I think that the US wasn't far-right? No. In fact, well before Trump took over the Republican Party, the base of the Republican Party was predominantly far-right, supporting nativism, authoritarianism, anti-establishment sentiments, perhaps populism. And we all knew that, at least the ones who read surveys. It was clear. However, the party was at that point captured by mainstream conservatives. And so they couldn't translate it electorally because of the electoral system. Like, third parties don't work. So the far right support was hidden. To a certain extent, what Trump did was make the party leadership more representative of its base. And I didn't expect that because the grip of the establishment, as well as the money involved, kept these people out. But Trump is unique in so many different ways. But the most important thing is that in the US, the core value for politicians is name recognition, because this is a huge country and not particularly well informed, which means that almost no politician or aspiring politician is known to a majority of the population. Trump has been a public figure outside of politics for decades and had a name recognition that was almost at the same level as the president. And like there are 2-3 other people like that, Oprah Winfrey, like Kim Kardashian. That's the level that you're talking about. And so the idea that one of those would enter a race is so outside of. So this is very important. Like, it's not as if any other radical right politician could have captured the Republican Party at this stage. And so that's why I didn't see it coming. Like, once he won the nomination, I thought it was going to be very close. I still thought that he would lose. It's the same as Brexit. I thought both would be very close, but I thought in both cases they would lose.
Yeah, on this last point, one thing that is very impressive, I find, is that if you talk to people going through this process, this idea that you think it won't happen, because we had this exactly same feeling with Bolsonaro until the very last moment. And we saw now in Argentina as well, colleagues who were following, reading, and after all the experiences that accumulated, they still think in the last moment that it won't happen. That's probably something more at the collective psychological element, I'm not sure. But actually the question I wanted to make is, because what you said is, of course, the conservatism or the basis for the come to power of the far right has been there, maybe in many countries, definitely probably in Brazil as well, in terms of the cultural conservatism. But this translation through parties and through power in government was not. So what you're saying is that at one hand, the institutions matter, the political system, the parties, and on the other hand, the communication patterns. Because, so my question is, we discussed a lot about the role of the social medias in these parties, and what you said when Trump being a public figure, and we see that in other cases too, but also the possibility to make a public figure like Milei, apparently in the last months now, has been created. So do you think this lack of intermediation of politics, being parties, being the media, can also be a factor together with this cultural backlash and economic factors?
I think we get carried away too easily, and we always look for new things to happen, but often they're actually old things. And so, first of all, institutions do matter, but they don't determine everything. So what we see is that the far right can win in proportional systems and in majoritarian systems. They can win in presidential systems and in parliamentary systems. Now, they all create their own pros and cons, but the far right can win in them. And so we have to be very careful to think that you can institutionally kind of like engineer them away. It doesn't work like that. The other thing is that there's nothing specific about the far right and the way that they organize, I think, in terms of structure. The reason that they win without strong parties in Latin America is just because you have a presidential system, and many people have won without a strong political party, because that works within a presidential system. But Trump won because he was the leader of the Republican Party. Had he been a third-party candidate, he wouldn't have stood a chance. In Europe, which are parliamentary systems, which are both built around political parties, the far right that have strong parties are the far right that are most important. And so this is, the far right is not an antithesis to political parties, and the far right is not innovative institutionally. It pretty much reflects whatever the institutional dominant model is in the country. Now, with regard to the media, again, so I'm a skeptic on the transformative power of social media. I don't see the evidence at the moment. I do believe that the far right, as well as others, have profited from the diminished power of the traditional gatekeepers in the media. However, I think that in most countries, and certainly for Europe, a bit less so in the US, but undoubtedly similarly in much of the rest of the world and Latin America, the traditional media was, until roughly the 1980s, owned by institutions that were close to mainstream political parties, be they churches, be they trade unions, be they other types of actors. What we saw in the 1980s was a privatization of the traditional media. We saw private TV come up, private radio. We saw privatization of newspapers. That had a very strong effect. It made gatekeeping different because it was now all about profit. And so if a story about an outsider, right, could potentially threaten the frame of the mainstream, but would also generate a lot of money, it would be included. And moving towards that more market-oriented media structure created part of the power of social media, because there were already very few gatekeepers, and because the argument and the key motive was profit, social media could have that impact. But we should not overestimate the role of social media. I mean, Trump didn't win because of Twitter, he won because of CNN. Milei also didn't come up through social media, he came up through traditional TV. That doesn't mean that, for example, WhatsApp played a major role in the mobilization of Bolsonaro, but Bolsonaro wouldn't have even been a factor had he not been visible through the traditional platforms. So I think that these are generally, they're catalysts. Social media are catalysts. They particularly make things easier and faster. Right? I mean, we could already mobilize around the established structures, but social media makes it even faster. But it is not a unique tool for the far right. There are various examples of mainstream politicians who are as good, if not better, with social media. AOC in the US being the prime example of that, right? But so even if the far right has used social media better than others, that is not a definitional matter that can be changed.
Yeah. In a way, at least in Brazil, what we saw is that Bolsonaro started with social media as a key space for his campaign, but now all parties catch up. So perhaps that was more because of the novelty. But that brings me to another question is exactly about this this transnational aspect. That, I mean, how do you see this simultaneously? Is it a coincidence that we have all this far right in so many countries, or can we talk about the direct influence of Trump, for instance, in Latin America? Or is this more the general diffusion of ideas and processes that reinforce each other? How do you see this? The fact that it seems that the far right became a has a global dimension in this current phase.
Yeah, I think that there are at certain levels developments that are largely global, even though some countries are exempt from that and others, right? I mean, I think first of all, we should theorize the end of the Cold War much more. The Cold War had a very strong grip on how politics was played out, on what the limits of experimentation were, because there was this massive threat outside. And so it opened the door to a lot of new things. It also opened the door to much more fundamental critique of the liberal democratic system and of the capitalist system. And so that is much more important, I think, than than we often see. The other thing is neoliberalism, much more like as an ideology to me than necessarily an economic system, which was also largely global, which weakened the idea of the state, which weakened particularly how mainstream politicians presented their own power. They often argued that they didn't have power because of the market. And so the primacy of politics was denied largely. And that creates possibilities for outsiders like the far right, who on the one hand like are a risk, but that is not as problematic anymore because there is no communism, right? On the other one, it's a fundamental critique of particularly liberal democracy rather than capitalism, but sometimes also capitalism, which again is possible in a post-Cold War world, which claims the primacy of politics, which goes against neoliberalism, right? And so there are these type of things. There is, of course, social media, other things. There are massive crises that are global, from 9/11 to the Great Recession, that has made the 21st century a century of crises, in which, of course, crisis means that the establishment has failed. And so again, opportunities, right? So I do believe that there are global trends, but every election is first and foremost a national occasion. And to understand why Bolsonaro wins, like, you don't look at the elections in the US. Bolsonaro is a prime example of also how careful we should be with over-rationalizing things. Had Lula run in those elections, there would not have been a Bolsonaro, and we would never have had this conversation. It doesn't mean that there wasn't a potential for the far right. It was always there, but there wouldn't have been a far right president. So the idea that that Brazilians would vote in a certain way because Americans vote in a certain way, it's just not very rational. That being said, the US is important. And for people who were already far right and who kind of were looking for a far right candidate, but at the same time felt, because that is what the mainstream media always said, that those are not serious actors. and those are too risky. Those will isolate your country. Having a far-right president in the US takes that away, right? I mean, under Biden, Bolsonaro is a risk for Brazil. Under Trump, Bolsonaro is a potential asset, right? And so in that sense, Trump did have an impact. He normalized like what in many countries had been seen as outside of the acceptable. But to me, that is roughly where the level is. All this nonsense about Bannon masterminding campaigns or the Bolsonaro sons, like, I mean, if they were so smart, like, they would have had Bolsonaro and Trump reelected. And clearly they didn't.
Hopefully they won't come back. And when talking about Latin America, and despite all the differences as well, I think one of the issues is that in the conceptual discussion, there's a discussion about the relation between the far right and populism. And in Latin America, we do have a traditional majority, but also populist rhetoric on the left and not on the right. So do you think, how do you relate populism with the far right in different parts of the world? Because again, in Latin America, this move from a discussion about left populism immediately, even historically, not only in the 50s, but also immediately before Bolsonaro, to what can be also conceptualized as a populism of the right. How do you relate populism with the far right then?
I very simply stated, the extreme right is not populist because it's elitist. And the radical right is more related to populism. However, I think that the concept is used too broadly. And I also think, as a logical consequence of the mainstreaming of many radical right actors, their populism decreases. And so when I wrote my book in 2007, it was mostly based on the third wave, the 80s, 90s, in which the radical right was almost universally excluded. Populism was a key aspect. If I look at radical right parties today, from the Brothers of Italy to Sweden Democrats to the Danish People's Party to Ja21 in the Netherlands, these are fully mainstream parties, and populism is just not part of it anymore. Bolsonaro in 2018, according to most of the studies I saw, was not populist. Bolsonaro in 2022 probably was, because he had been excluded by a large portion of the mainstream while in power, which is kind of weird. With Trump, it was the other way around. But Bolsonaro was not really an excluded candidate. I mean, he was pretty much endorsed by much of the media elite and much of the economic elite in Brazil, but even by the Wall Street Journal. And he didn't consider the broader right-wing establishment as his enemy. When the neoliberals left and the media left, like, his campaign became much more populist. And so populism is partly situational. It's of course not exclusive to the right. Traditionally, this is more the case in Europe, but certainly not in the US. The US has a very populist culture in general. So I think, for me, though, the main difference between the radical right, the far right in Latin America and let's say the global north, Europe and North America, is not in populism. It is actually in nativism. And in my conception of the far right, and it's important to stress that there are other conceptions, nativism is essential. And so it's about the ethnic divide. And That is the case in the US. That's the case in both Western and Eastern Europe. It's not simply limited to immigration. It can also be related to domestic minorities, like African Americans, for example. While I believe that particularly Cas and Bolsonaro have a nativist agenda and have a nativist perception of Chilean society and Brazilian society, it's implicit and it is secondary. Their core ideological agenda is authoritarianism, and at least in their rhetoric, neoliberalism, which also includes Milei. Neoliberalism is not so central in the radical right in Europe. There are actually various parties that are highly critical of neoliberalism. And economics is always secondary to the radical right in Europe. And so I'm struggling, to be honest, I'm struggling a little bit with considering Bolsonaro, Cast, and certainly Milei as examples of the far right in the understanding that I have in Europe and North America. I recently read a book about nativism that kind of redefines nativism by focusing on foreignness as a kind of an attitude than rather than foreigners. But I worry a little bit that takes it too broad. Like, yes, you can argue that Bolsonaro and Cast make clear distinctions between who are real Brazilians or Chileans and who are not. But I'm not sure whether that is enough to bring these together. So I mean, I'm just not convinced yet. And I think that if so, we probably need subtypes, because logically, those who exclude on the basis of ethnicity create at least very different policies than those who do it on the basis of religion. That being said, and that will be my last on this, but things are complicated. Religion in the meaning of most of the radical right is not religion in the meaning of the Christian right. Yes, Bolsonaro talks a lot about Christianity and being reborn and all those kind of things, but Christianity is still not so much about the Bible. It's about culture. It's about certain political values rather than your relationship to God. And so this is what is sometimes called Christianism or cultural Christianity. And in that sense, it's not so far away from national culture. Right?
Yeah, I think we've been discussing that in our own project, the question of nativism, and definitely in the case of Latin America, the issue of, well, racism, but also all these recent movements, and especially in Chile, you know, of course, that anti-indigenous groups, and that's very clear in Bolsonaro. So, but I think that's where we probably can continue collaborating. But in terms of the interview, I have, because I don't want to take too much of your time, but I have two more questions. One about this question of normalization that you already talked about, and it seems to be something deeper. How, as we have more and more also from this phenomena, be the cultural phenomena of conservatism and authoritarianism, and the parties and the leaders who take up those flags and openly also make that rhetoric, that conservative rhetoric and discriminative, and you make use of nativism and etc. I mean, we do more and more normalize now, and I understand that you're studying that. And how do you see this process in a way, linking it to the fact that it's a global phenomenon? Do you see that democracy itself might be changed through this process that we are living now? After all, I mean, the democratic theory, at least in Latin America, there was a lot of discussion about participation in the last 20 years. And even if there was a lot of criticism of representative democracy and all the incapacity of democracy to bring, for instance, exactly deep structures, transformation, and reduce the inequalities, still it was called democracy, and the discussion about representative, participatory, and so on and so on. But with this normalization process, do you think that democracy itself will change? There'll be new dimensions that will become more relevant than, for instance, participation, representation. How is this connection between peoples and their governments somehow changing through this?
That's a difficult one. I think it's very important to note the difference between the far right today and the far right at the beginning of the 20th century. There is actually a radicalization of the radical right, in which I mean that actors, parties, or politicians that claimed to support democracy as in popular sovereignty and majority rule, but only had issues with the liberal aspects of it, mostly minority rights, separation of power, have either in statements or in actions also attacked fundamental aspects of democracy. We can think, of course, at the coup d'état attempts in both DC and Brasilia, but also the calls for violence of both Bolsonaro and Trump. We see some kind of nostalgia for military dictatorship in both Cas and Bolsonaro. And we see the complete dismantling of democracy in Hungary, for example, and attempts of that in Poland. However, what is crucial is that this is all done in the name of real democracy. And that was not the case in the early 20th century. Right? Hitler did not demolish democracy to create a better democracy. He didn't believe in democracy. And so we have increasingly this weird mismatch between the discourse of various far-right leaders, that is, I am the real Democrat, and the activity, which, for example, here, the majority of Republican voters and candidates are now denying the results of the last election, which was probably the best organized US presidential election in history. But they claim to do that because there was fraud and they want real democracy. That is really difficult. At the same time, when you look at the debates, when you look at the argumentation, what you generally see is that it is a racialized view of democracy. Or at the very least, it is for the sake of argument now, a nativist, whether it's defined as the ethnically pure or the religiously pure people. Because here, for example, when you see at where it went wrong, it always went wrong in New York or California, which are not just liberal. These are the most multicultural, multiracial parts of the city. It goes wrong in Atlanta and in Detroit, which are black cities, right? Or in Hungary, it's Budapest, and Budapest is cosmopolitanism, right? And so the idea is that in terms of, if you talk, do we have a different type of democracy? I think for the far right and populism, actually, in general, it's never about participation. Participation is only important in the phase to change the system, to get the leader in power. And the fact that it remains high in the first years in certain systems has to do with presidential system. Like, I think about Chavez. Chavez comes to power but doesn't have support in Congress, and so he needs to mobilize to get power. In a parliamentary system, you don't. because once you win the election and form the government, you also have, by definition, a parliamentary majority. Milei will probably try to mobilize still because he doesn't have the support of Congress, right? But it is not an essential element of populism or the far right, because the idea is that the leader or leaders are the voice of the people. And so it's not there. Representation is crucial to the far right, but it's different in the sense that, again, it's a monist vision. And so the idea is that the far right leaders are exactly the same as the far right people. And so they don't, in the narrow sense, they don't represent, they are, right? They are the same. I think if there's anything in which the far right changes the conception of democracy, it is in who is part of the citizenry, and who has a right to be represented in that sense. And in that sense, like, they have a narrow conception of citizens, and so certain citizens, while legally part of the nation, are actually morally or ethnically or whatever it is not part of the nation. And I mean, you can call this white supremacy in the US context, or whatever it is, Christian supremacy in the Brazilian one. Of course, Christian and white are not necessarily like different. They're all very interrelated. But that is it. So, and this makes the conversation so hard, because we get Democrats against Democrats who use the same word, but in very different understandings.
Thank you. That discussion, I think we can have really perhaps in further it in our research and contact with you. And I have then a last question, last but not least, because actually it's one of the focus of our research, as I said, which is since we have an interdisciplinary group, many also we are working from the international relations. So we are very concerned also with the impact of the far right at the multilateral system. We saw that under Bolsonaro, and that's valid also for Trump and others. There were some trends like the denialism of COVID and climate change, and even Milei now is also bringing back the question of denialism of climate change. And because of a certain patriotism, in the case of Latino-Americano, this neo-patriotism, a certain vision of associated with nativism, but also in terms of foreign policy, more isolationist. No? So Bolsonaro removed Brazil from region organizations, for instance, and multilateral institutions as well. And the whole accusation of the UN as a phenomenon of cultural Marxism, and so you know all that discussion. So our concern has been, is that from in the beginning we were thinking, is that something from Bolsonaro and maybe also Trump, or is that something about the far right that's linked to this crisis of multilateralism that we are having, of course, waves of contestation for a long time. But in the case of Latin America and Brazil, for a long time, it was a contestation of the multilateral system in terms of changing it, not really abolishing it or removing it. And Bolsonaro was the first to really put it bluntly, no, this multilateral system as we have, again, it's something that's not worth, and started removing Brazil from all these institutions. And so how do you see that? Is there a connection between the far right and the crisis of multilateral system, the liberal order, and there are different concepts being used to it? Is it something related then nothing to the far right, but also changes in terms of US hegemony in the world, and the break of its own democratic exceptionalism caused also a certain weakening of the concept of the whole system created after the Second War? Do you see any connection about those phenomena?
So I think that's interesting, but also think that there's a lot of speculation based on cherry picking. So the far right was not overall skeptical of COVID. In many countries, the far right were among the first to acknowledge it. They were among the first to call for strong responses by the state. There are various parties that never in any way denied COVID or said that it wasn't important. Most of them only started to oppose government when they started to impose measures. And so most of them were not against vaccines. They were against what they call like the two-tier system of those who are vaccinated and non-vaccinated. They were particularly opposed against compulsory vaccination, things like that. Climate change, at best, is a very recent phenomenon. The traditional far right, the ones that I studied in the 80s, 90s, tended to be actually relatively green, which makes sense because the old school nationalism, what we call Völkisch, thinking the nation is part, the territory is part of the nation. And so this is the Blut und Boden, the blood and soil idea of the Nazis, but it predates the Nazis and it goes after the Nazis. And so a lot of the old school nationalists are actually very concerned with the environment because that is part of their nation. As far as climate change and, let's say, environmentalism is rejected, it's rejected as part of cultural Marxism, kind of the idea. It's seen as either a hoax, which is rare, or as an instrument by the establishment to stay in power, and also that the measures are mostly hurting the regular people and keeping the establishment kind of out of the loop, which to a large extent is true. Many of the measures are kind of flat tax type level, which hurt the marginalized people much more than the upper middle class. And so I don't really see that as being inherent in a world where the mainstream would deny climate change. The far right would probably take it up. I do think that they have a different vision of the world because in nativism, you see the world as hostile. So what you believe is that every nation should take care of itself first. And consequently, like, it's a dog-eat-dog world. It's a zero-sum game, right? And no better example of that than Trump. Like, Trump is incredibly clear about it. But what you then also see is Trump was always very positive about Xi Jinping. And he would say about how the Chinese took advantage of the weakness of the US. And he doesn't blame Xi Jinping for that because he believes that every leader should do that. He blames the American leaders for not doing the same, right? And so in that world, multilateralism doesn't make sense. Bilateralism is the only thing that you can go for. And again, you see that with Trump. Like, Trump doesn't understand the EU. He doesn't understand, like, the concept that you negotiate with a bloc rather than individual countries. But he also doesn't believe that countries would actually do that. That countries would actually give up part of their sovereignty, right? And so I think that's inherent to the far right. It doesn't mean that they can't collaborate, but they mostly collaborate on the basis of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? Which is part, like, why they embrace Israel, or many of them embrace Israel. It's Islamophobia. It's not because they like Jews or because they like Israel. But it also means that almost by definition, collaborations between the radical right are always weaker. Because they're always driven by purely domestic concerns. Whereas at least in theory, the left believes in international solidarity and those kind of things. And so what would you get out of that? Now, first of all, everything that is seen as the established system, be that national or international, is opposed, because that is the establishment. And so you're against it. You're against the EU, you're against the UN, you're against all these kind of things, not necessarily even for the policies, but because of the power relations that are in it. But you're also fundamentally distrustful of of transnational organizations, of international organizations, because on the one hand, it goes against your whole logic of how you think the world works, and on the other hand, it diminishes sovereignty, national sovereignty. And so the most interesting thing, though, is that the effect so far has been minimal, which has a lot to do with the fact that Trump is not a politician, has no program, and so mostly took the US out of stuff. Bolsonaro, kind of the same. They don't have visions of an alternative. They don't reshape the order. They don't even destroy it, which actually Trump could have. Like, imagine Trump takes the US out of NATO. NATO is dead. Right? The US, unlike any other country, can blow up almost everything. But it didn't, because he doesn't have those type of visions, which means that after 4 years of Trump, the international system is roughly the same. However, it now understands that US support is conditional. Now, the second term of Trump, should it come, will be different, I think. He will have people with ideas. I think he will do different things. But I think what it also shows is that, and what the far right masks, is actually the more fundamental crisis within the old systems and multilateralism and everything. And again, you have to go back to the end of the Cold War. The Cold War kept together all kind of organizations which were actually not particularly popular. It's very hard to sustain an organization like NATO without its original purpose. Putin has put it back on the agenda for the Europeans, but not necessarily for the Americans. And so I think that played a major role. Then, of course, we had a unipolar world, which didn't go particularly well with the US. But let's not remember that the neoconservatives also had absolutely no interest in multilateralism and in transnational and international organizations. And so it's not unique to the far right. First of all countries work within the rules if that works for them, and not if it doesn't work for them. It's just that only a few are powerful enough to do it. It's not because the Americans are particularly arrogant or chauvinist. I'm sure that if the Dutch would have similar power, they would also ignore the UN whenever they could. But the far right does it much more brazenly. And I think, again, for the far right, there is fundamentally a different worldview. And so collaboration is always instrumental, and it's always temporary.
Right. No, thank you. I mean, guys, a lot of issues, honestly, we are continue discussing, and probably Monica will also will probably invite you for also some online conference, because we are trying to finalize some material about Bolsonaro, moving a bit forward now to other Latin American. But this has been really, especially this discussion about normalization, I think it's really there for us to continue, if possible, thinking, because that's how we see these new elections of when perhaps Bolsonaro or his son or whatever will come, it's a different context. It's one where a lot of things were normalized. It was not the shock or that impression that, oh, he won't win, but things were normalized. So in a way, it would be a more conscious vote, not so much a vote of contestation or anti-Lulismo here, anti-Peronismo in Argentina, but a more conscious. So
yeah, and I think
so
actually that's a part that is kind of missed, right? I mean, people herald the elections of 2020 in the US and 2022 in Brazil. I found both elections almost more depressing than the original ones of 2016, 2018. Because in 2016, 2018, both Trump and Bolsonaro were argued to be people who either didn't mean what they said or were going to be controlled by the adults in the room, which was very much the discourse. 4 years later, we all knew what they stood for. We all knew what they did, and yet they marginally lost, mostly because of COVID, right? And so what that showed is that while people not necessarily support this radical view, they are okay with it under certain conditions. And that is part normalization. It's part polarization or perceived polarization. I mean, in the sense that for a Bolsonaro supporter, the PT is as extreme as for a non-Bolsonaro supporter, the Bolsonaro is, right? And so this is pretty much how Hitler came to power. Like, I mean, Hitler came to power because the Germans saw only two options: communism or fascism. And in many countries, presidential systems, particularly Brazil, but also France to a certain extent, you see that there are only two options. And if the other option is then created as communism by its own infrastructure, which was a little bit easier with the PT than with the Democratic Party, but even the Democratic Party can be painted like that. Then you have a sizable portion of the population which is mainstream right, which really hasn't radicalized much in values, but has radicalized in the way it perceives the other one, and at what is at stake. And I think that if we want to fight the far right, we actually have to bring down the temperature in that respect, right? And this comes out of the liberals, mostly the centrists. Right? The centrists who all the time talk about the wokeness of the left and whatever, they play into the hands of the far right, and they make people who actually don't like Bolsonaro or Trump because they're too radical think like, well, okay, but at least they're not communist.
Yeah, that's pretty much the key word for in Brazil, like communism and with Venezuela and Cuba. So in a way, it's you're right. I think has a lot to do also with this vocabulary that that was from the previous fight, so to speak. Do you have any question for us, guys? Or I mean, would definitely.
No,
right.
I mean, not really. I think that, to me personally, I think what is least studied, or at least in my opinion, but I don't follow it that close, least impressively, is foreign policy. Not so much international connections. I think that there's a lot written about it, and most of it is really bad. But the international, like the perspective of the far right, and then what they do, because for a long time that was irrelevant to us because they never came to power, right? And the context of Europe is so different as well that that in that respect we were always focused on the EU because that is foreign policy for us. And then there was a little bit about whether you were pro-Russia or not and pro-US or not. but there wasn't too much about like actually doing stuff, because you were like, it is so new that the far right is actually in power. Like, we forget that. Like, but actually in Europe, in Western Europe, like, Meloni is the first far right prime minister. The far right was in coalitions, but there were always junior partners, and junior partners don't make foreign policy. Right? That's just not how it works. And so a lot of these things, despite the fact that we had all these leaders, like, are incredibly new and still pretty speculative, because, as I said when I was in Brazil, I don't think that the next far right president is a Bolsonaro. Both not in terms of the name, but also not in terms of the personality. It's going to be someone who probably is now a governor of a certain very rich and powerful state, or like someone else who comes from the mainstream, more like Cas than Bolsonaro. Because Bolsonaro and Trump are the ones that break the system. Jean-Marie Le Pen broke the system. Marine Le Pen is a completely different type of politician. Not that she's more moderate, she's more a traditional politician. And so the next politician comes in with ideas, right? Is not just going to sit on the sidelines and live in their own bubble. They're going, particularly the next far-right president in Brazil, is going to reshape Latin America. I mean, that is the very least that they will try to do.
Not, but in fact, I mean, one of the candidates, or at least the discussions, are about São Paulo Governor Tarcísio. But there is a lot of effort, of course, to contain, and actually a couple of weeks ago there was a big storm in São Paulo, and the city was without light for 3 days, and there was a lot of criticism of Tarcísio. So that's a little bit now the tactics of to try to avoid Tarcísio to become too big, that because he privatized electricity, and that was this disaster. I mean, São Paulo 3 days without light was really. But that was see how
that
it
was
goes.
protest in the city. That was protest in the city of Sao Paulo, which already is which is not his electorate. Right? His electorate is outside.
Much worse. The interior of Sao Paulo is the most conservative. You're right, yeah. But still, I mean, that's one of the candidates, right? And just to finalize, then I myself working and other colleagues on foreign policy. So I'm happy to send you the papers when they are ready. We are working with foreign policy of Bolsonaro in some areas, like in human rights, but also the question of transitional justice. So yeah, I think we can exchange on that, because that's our focus at the moment, to think about how the foreign policy was different. And I myself working, I'm using this concept of intermestic. You might know from the US in the 70s, Manning. I sent you the paper, I have a draft already. But because in the case of Brazil, foreign policy has been traditionally done either by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Itamaraty, or by presidential diplomacy. And so this concept I'm advancing is that is in a way shows the role of the Congress in Brazilian foreign policy. For the US, I think this is much more common, but in Brazil it was completely distant. I mean, there was almost no cases of, for instance, non-ratification of international treaties. Basically, foreign policy would be decided and the Congress was blunt about it. Some exceptions were some investment treaties in the 90s, but very specific things. But with Bolsonaro, what we saw is that all these conservative groups, and then here, a lot of militaries that were elected, the evangelic. So I use the concept of the bancada BBB. There was a coalition of the BBB that's for a church, the agribusiness, and the bullets. So a very specific coalition that was acting on foreign policy, because it saw domestic politics as connected to foreign policy. So that's the concept I'm advancing. I mean, it's not new for foreign policy theory. I mean, this intermestic is there, and also Rosenau used it for global politics, but in Brazil there was nothing. So let's see. I presented it a couple of times. We'll be publishing that. So that could be something new. And what I'm asking is, to what extent this is a far-right phenomenon, or it happened during Bolsonaro, but the Congress will become more active anyway now in the future. So I think that's a very specific for the Brazilian setting. No? But that's how we are discussing that. I'm happy to send you the paper, and if you want to send some comments, that would be great as well.
Yeah, I mean,
Good.
feel free to send me stuff that you guys publish.
No, that's great.
I work mostly on other topics at the moment, but I try to read.
Yeah, no, great. Yeah, so we are in this struggle here. I mean, not really relaxed doing research. Our research assistants, they are, I also feel pity for them, because they have to read all this horrible news and catalog, and I say we have to bring them for a holiday so they are not that depressed. So what are your tips? Your tip for not being depressed studying this?
I actually I took a break from the news. I went off social media. I haven't given interviews in months. I'm only now slowly returning to writing op-eds at times. It's just too much. And so I think this is one of the good things that comes out of the debates of the last couple of years, is just the combination of mental health and work. And we should be much more considerate of that, because as I said, this is a century of crisis. The crisis hits young people much more than older people. Many of us have certain buffers. Many young people don't, and they are bombarded with either bad news or confusing news or whatever, and it's important that we keep that in mind, because that didn't used to be the case, right? I mean, and so I actually really like that. I mean, within the study of the far right, this is something that among younger communities, particularly those who work with the internet, where it's even worse, of course, has really been taken up, and there are the discussions of how to protect scholars, both against the far right, but also mental health. And I think it is important. I mean, look, some people shouldn't study this because it makes them too upset. Like, I mean, I also don't focus on certain things because it makes me upset. But for even people, I'm not overly sensitive to this. I never was, in part because the far right wasn't that important. Like, I find it much harder to study the far right today than in the 80s, 90s. And in the 80s, in the 90s, I was reading far right propaganda 6-7 hours a day. But it didn't upset me. Now, when I read the newspaper, I'm upset. And so it is important. We also shouldn't catastrophize. Right? I mean, Bolsonaro is out of power. It's not certain that he comes back. It's not certain that the far right is going to be dominant. It's not certain that Trump can come back. He can come back, but he as easily can lose. And so I think like there's also this this competition of who has the worst like prediction of the future. Is it going to be fascism or civil war? Like, and it's like maybe it's just going to be muddling through. Like,
hopefully, I find it also that would be definitely, but muddling through forward. Hopefully.
exactly.
Thank you very much, Cas. I mean,
You're
we
welcome.
will probably be inviting you for a couple of other things in the near future. Yes, and good luck there as well, no? With the, well, not only domestic elections, but also with research.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you then.